They laughed, first as a ripple, then as a chorus. Coffee cups paused mid-air. A half-empty pack of cigarettes looked abandoned in someone's palm. The kid at the doorway felt the laugh land on him like cold rain. He stood there with his backpack slung over one shoulder, a notebook pressed to his chest like an excuse, hair still smelling faintly of youth and summer grass. He was 17. He had a camera slung by a strap, a school ID clipped inside his wallet, and a question he couldn't cleanly say out loud. Could he tell their story? The room smelled like wet leather and oil, old smoke, and the kind of coffee that had been reheated more than once. Sun slid through blinds, striping the faces of men who wore the years of asphalt in their hands. On the far wall, faded photographs hung crooked. A chalkboard listed rides and dates, names carved into its margins. "Who's the kid?" someone said. Laughter soft at first, then sharper. "School project? Gonna make us look like a charity commercial?" He braced for the worst. The worst, he thought, was entering a room that was not made for him. Then the door opened again, and the sound that followed was not laughter. It was an engine. Slow, measured, like a locomotive that remembered a river. It cut the room down to silence. Heads turned. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Even the cigarette smoke seemed to hold itself together. Graham walked in like he always did, steady, a little stooped from carrying things that don't go away, leather soft at the elbows like an old saddle. He smelled faintly of pine cleaner and motor oil. The years had made the lines at his eyes a map of jokes told and hard nights survived. The room folded around him when he moved. The way people made space for him was not because of what he said, but because of what he had done. On his chest, stitched to a worn cut, a patch caught the light. Founding member, 1971. That single rectangle of cloth stopped every laugh in its tracks. The air went thin. Respect, old and declarative, filled the silence like a tide. The kid's heart did something dizzy and new. "My boy," Graham said, voice rough as gravel. "This is Eli. He's doing what did you call it again?" "A documentary," Eli blurted, "for school. It's, about the club, about what you do." There was a soft murmur. Someone clinked a spoon against their mug to cover a smile, and failed. Then Maria, who could stitch a name into a patch without looking, leaned in. She had hands that remembered every seam she'd ever fixed, and eyes that wore their own stitches like medals. "School project, huh?" she said. Her tone wasn't kind nor cruel, just practical. "Anybody else gonna bring a camera to a meeting? They'll end up with a view of Hank's feet." Hank, who had been nursing his cup in a corner, raised an eyebrow and looked pointedly at Eli's shoes. Laughter, the human kind this time, broke like small waves, but it wasn't mean. The room had shifted. The laughter had an edge, but also a welcome. Eli let out a breath he hadn't known he was holding. Graham set his hand on Eli's shoulder as if to anchor him. That touch was permission. You may stand here, but you don't belong yet. That distinction would be important. Respect in that room was earned. By showing up, by fixing things, by learning to listen. Eli took a step in, notebook now in his hands, the nervous shake in his voice steadying. "I want to record stories," he said, "about the rides, the names, why you honor them. I want to understand what the patch means." A softness moved through the room. Maria's laugh faded. Derek, whose suspicion was a permanent fixture, folded his arms and watched Eli like you watch bad weather. "We don't mind folks remembering," Derek said finally, voice low. "But this isn't a museum. You want to sit in here with a camera and poke? You better be ready to ride when we tell you to." Eli nodded. He had a driver's permit. He could fold himself into a pillion seat. He had no illusions about toughing it out. He had come to learn, not to prove anyone wrong. But there was a stubbornness in him, a part that had always wanted to be present where stories lived. He wanted to earn the right to listen. "All right then," Graham said. "You follow, you help, you keep quiet when we ask. You get one ride, see how you do. Take notes." If permission had a price, Eli would find out what it was over the next weeks. The price was sweat. The price was waiting. The price was learning to let silence be part of the conversation. If you want to see how a kid earns a place among veterans, stay with us. The first ride cracked dawn like an egg. The air smelled of gasoline and blue sky. Engines grumbled awake. Gloves came on like armor. Eli watched hands at work. Gloves tugged on, helmets buckled, boots scuffed and set. A leather jacket pressed into his chest as he was helped onto the back of a bike for the first time. The weight of it wasn't heavy in the way he feared. It was heavy in the way of responsibility, as if he were carrying a guest's plate across a crowded table. The road outside town stretched into a ribbon of gray. Wind stuck in Eli's throat, forced his eyes tight at first, then opened them to a new way of seeing. Faces set in concentration, small rituals like taps on the tank. The ride wasn't glamorous. It wasn't a movie montage of reckless abandon. It was long hours of steady throttle, hands pinging the grip in habitual rhythms, a shared radio squawk that connected them like bloodlines. He did not try to be brave. He tried instead to be present. When a man a few bikes ahead glanced back, they made eye contact, an island of recognition, and Eli felt the beginning of an answer. Back at the club after the ride, they did what the club did best. They talked. Not speeches, stories. Hank, the unofficial archivist with a voice like warmed tar, told of nights when they saved a buddy from something the world had thrown at him and didn't tell the papers. Maria said nothing about saving anyone. She spoke about stitches and women who had to sew patches into sleeves because their hands couldn't hold the grief anymore. Derek scrutinized every anecdote like a man checking a tool before a job. Eli filled notebooks in a way he didn't know he could. He wrote down names, dates, jokes that sounded like survival. He sketched the lines in Graham's hands, the way Maria's tongue poked at the corner of her mouth when she deliberated, the way Tommy's name in Hank's sentence had made the talk shift like a weather front. Tommy. No one said the rest of it aloud, not yet. At night, Eli replied to the pull of youth and called his mother. She answered like she always did, steady, careful. "How did it go?" she asked. "It was different," he said. "They laughed at first, then they didn't. Dad, Graham, they listen when he walks in." "Just remember why you're doing this," she said, "and don't romanticize it." He promised. He also lied a little, by omission. He didn't tell her how a man's hands had trembled when he took a name out of his pocket and traced it gently. He didn't tell her about the patch's heavy silence. He didn't tell her the way it felt like being pressed into a story he had only been sketching in the margins of his life. In the weeks that followed, earning their quiet trust meant work. Eli learned to pass a wrench without fumbling. He learned that tools had a language, the scrape of socket on bolt, the sweet little hiss of air from a loosened tube. He learned to be useful in small, precise ways. Hold the flashlight at the right angle. Fetch the right-sized bolt. Anchor a bike so a man whose hands were less steady could work on a carburetor without his coffee sloshing over the bench. Maria taught him how to thread a needle, and it felt like an initiation. Her hands were patient, and she explained each motion not as a lesson but as a story. "You don't rush through a stitch," she said. "You give it attention. A stitch is a promise. If it comes loose, the promise comes undone." Eli practiced. His first patch he sewed crooked. The thread looped like a child's scrawl. Maria smoothed his fingers and guided them.
He tried again. The second patch held. He held it more carefully after that, as if the cotton and thread could hold memory. He rode on longer trips as his confidence grew. Roads cut across farms and whispers of interstate wind. The rides taught him limits, how the night could flatten sound, how tiredness could make a safe bend feel like a trap. He learned to respect both machine and rider, to understand that skill wasn't daring, but steadiness. Still, not everyone softened. Derek watched from the periphery, suspicion in his jawline. "You gonna write something nice about us?" he asked once, voice flat.
"I'm going to write what's true," Eli answered. He didn't mean to be confrontational. It was simply the only honest option. Derek's look said he'd hear what he wanted. As familiar names took shape in his notes, Eli began to notice how the club held grief. Memorial rides were never loud ceremonies of empty mourning. They were slow, careful processes. A ride would end at a cemetery at dawn, bikes parked like sentries. Names were read aloud, full names, the dates like a ledger of meaning, and each name was followed by a story, not an epitaph. The act of telling these little stories felt active, like someone repairing something broken in the world. It was through these rituals that Tommy's absence first became a presence. Tommy had been a name with a jagged edge. Hank would start a sentence, and the air would change when he reached for that memory. Once, in the dim light of the garage, Hank put a hand on a dented gas tank and said, "Tommy didn't see the same future as the rest of us." The sentence hung there, unresolved. People shifted. Eli pressed his pen harder. He wanted to understand the wound, but he also felt a nervousness settle in his bones. The wound was old, 15 years, rumors suggested. But here was the truth about accumulation. Old wounds crust over and become part of the anatomy. They hurt differently, but they shape how you move. One afternoon, Eli found his way into a quieter corner where Graham and Hank had a slow conversation. Graham's hands twisted a rag. Hank's voice was a low thing, almost confiding. They spoke in fragments, dates, events, names, like they were threading a needle with pieces of the past. "Tommy left 'cause he thought we were getting soft," Graham said. "Wanted us to be more, what's the word, militant. He thought outreach was singing songs in the church basement. He didn't like the idea of us giving time to folks who weren't one of us." Hank snorted. "Tommy's gone off to play soldier in his mind. You can't have both. You can't be the kind of place that patches veterans and also hold the line that says only veterans deserve help." "It's complicated," Graham said. "Tommy thought we were selling out. I thought he wasn't listening to the people who needed a place to be." Eli watched them. He felt the weight of history compress into the lines of their faces. The club had been a shelter in the worst nights for some of them. For others, it was a fence, delineating who was in and who was out. The conversation raised questions Eli had come to ask. What does it mean to be family? How do you make room for the world without losing the reason you came together? Weeks slid into months. Eli's camera became an extension of him, less obtrusive in the way he held it, more like a handfold to steady a story. He placed microphones near tables where stories happened consequentially, not theatrically. He learned that narrative didn't need drama. It needed honesty, shaped by small details. One evening, as rain tapped the roof of the clubhouse like a percussionist testing beats, a rumor reached them. Tommy was back. People moved around as if a wind had shifted. For some, the name had been a sharp seam that would not lay flat. For others, it was a notice that the past insisted on being rearranged. Tommy's return did not arrive with fanfare. He walked in, quiet, older, the years cutting him down like pruning. He didn't wear the swagger of a man who'd find solving things easy. He had a scar at his jaw, a hand that still knew the motions of checking a bike, but did not trust its own gentleness. He looked at Graham with something like accusation and longing braided together. "Tommy," Hank said, voice small. The word was a key that unlocked 15 years of silence. The room held its breath. Old friendships and old fights were like two people who had been married a long time, long memory, complicated love. Tommy did not waste time with small talk. He made it a point to look at each of them. "I hear you got a kid documenting now," he said to Graham. "Boy or girl?" "Son," Graham said. "Eli." Tommy's eyes flicked to Eli and paused. There was no kindness there at first, but it didn't immediately harden. He put a palm on the table, as if steadying himself. "Thought I said I was done," he murmured. Then louder to the group, "I didn't come to start something. I came to talk. 15 years is a long time to hold a grudge." The history spilled out like a cracked jar. Old arguments, different visions for the club's purpose, certain nights when a decision was made and some left. Tommy's leaving had been a break that made two separate ways of seeing the club more obvious. Those who wanted to preserve what had always been, and those who believed the club should step out and offer help to whoever needed it, veteran or not. "Tommy thought we were soft for doing outreach," Graham said later, not defensive but factual. "He thought we were losing our line. He didn't like the idea of, even so, the idea that giving time to others could heal us too." Tommy folded his hands. "I thought we were supposed to be a place that bled for our own," he said. "I didn't know giving time to someone else could be for us too." The public meeting that followed was not a shout match, but a slow unpeeling of years. People said things they'd practiced in the privacy of little corners, small confessions that had been carrying weight. Derek bristled at first. It took him a long while to get comfortable with the idea that the club's identity could shift without erasing who they had been. Maria sat quietly, listening for fractures in her stitches. At some point, a choice had to be made. Was the club a museum of its past, or the hand it needed to extend? Could it be both? Could the thing that saved some of them be allowed to reach out and save others? Ideas that had lived in the margins for a long time were accidentally revealed.
They had, quietly, started a small outreach program. Visits to younger veterans at shelters, a weekend workshop fixing bikes for kids who couldn't afford it, an informal mentorship where a man who'd been through the dark sat with someone and simply listened. They had not made fanfare about it. Some members thought it was right to keep it small. Others felt it had to grow. Tommy's presence cracked something open, but not like a blunt instrument. It opened like a seam. The two men who had once been close, Graham and Tommy, found themselves in the garage fixing a broken exhaust pipe. They worked side by side, hands moving with an old familiarity, the kind that doesn't vanish even when years accumulate. The work was not dramatic. It was oil and grit and the kind of silence that is honest. "You think I'm wrong to want the club to stay to ourselves?" Tommy asked, rivets clanging. Graham didn't answer immediately. He wiped his hands on a rag and looked at the metal they were coaxing back into shape. "I think sometimes we get scared we'll lose something if we let it change," he said finally. "But I also think we lose people if we dig our heels in so hard that we don't notice when someone is bleeding." Their repair of metal became a metaphor you could feel. Two old shapes being reshaped by careful pressure. They tightened bolts together, and in that tightening there was a repair deeper than the one on the motorcycle. Eli watched from the doorway, notebook untouched. He understood that whatever story he took away would not be a single answer. It would be many, layered, held together by people who had chosen each other over and over. Outside, the weather sharpened. Dawn would come soon. A memorial ride was scheduled, an annual ride to a nearby cemetery where names were called like prayers and stories retold like offerings. This year, the ride would be different, not because the ritual was changing, but because the people were. People who had resisted outreach found themselves agreeing to a small new procession. They'd add a name to the list, a recently lost young man who had been reached by the club's quiet efforts, and they'd ask a teenager who had earned their trust to read the names. Before the ride, Maria called Eli aside. She had a small folded piece of cloth in her palm. Her hands trembled a little. "Sit," she said, as if sewing the next moment. She worked on the piece slowly, the movement of her hands a litany. Thread passed through cloth and pulled tight, then pulled back again. Each stitch was a beat. She talked as she worked, because that's how the old women did things, comfort by motion. "I've been sewing patches since I was a girl," she said. "Each one takes its own time. You have to respect what a patch carries. It isn't decoration, it's a responsibility." Eli watched as she revealed an alteration. A small square of cloth, the edges neat, the letters carefully embroidered. It was Graham's cut, modified subtly.
On the sleeve was an extra name sewn in small but certain letters, Eli. Eli's chest tightened. He had not expected this. It wasn't a membership given lightly. It was something else. A piece of fabric that said he belonged in a way that couldn't be taken back. His hand hovered over the cloth before he took it. "Why?" he started. Maria cut him off with a look that was both a rebuke and a benediction. "You didn't earn it because he's your father," she said. "You earned it because you showed up when it mattered. You took the long rides. You listened to the stories. You didn't take advantage. That counts." He thought of stitches and promises. He thought of Hank's stories and Tommy's return and Derek's wary glances that had, over time, turned softer. He thought of the morning they had read names and called them into the light. When the cut was placed against his jacket for him to try on, the numbers of years and the letters embroidered, "Founding Member, 1971, breathed a new meaning. It had a history, and now an extension. The patch didn't erase anything. It layered on. The memorial ride moved at dawn like an ancient thing. Engines hummed as if in respect. Helmets were different shapes. Some faces were weathered, some young. People fell into formation with a quiet competency. The horizon was a thin ribbon. Birds watched from telephone wires, uninterested in human grief, but present to the moment anyway. At the cemetery, bikes lined the path like guardians. The air was thin and cold. Families clustered, hands found one another. Names were read, full names, dates, stories. Each name was followed by a memory, and each memory was small and intimate. A favorite jacket, a lullaby hummed in the dark, a joke that had made a room laugh until someone had cried. The telling was not performative. It was a ritual of recognition. To speak a name aloud was to return a life to the company it deserved. When it was Eli's turn, he stepped forward with a steadying breath. His voice found the room with an authority that surprised him. He spoke about memory as work, how you carry a person not by placing them on a pedestal, but by continuing the tasks they had done. He spoke of stitches and oil, of nights they had held one another from falling apart. He told the story of a small boy who had come to an old room and been laughed at, and how the laughter had stopped because a patch had walked in. They listened. Some faces were unreadable, habitual in their ways. Others softened. A few men wiped at eyes. Derek's jaw had loosened in a way it hadn't for months. Eli read the names with the steadiness of someone who had practiced the art of attention. Name by name he read, and memory by memory he returned them to the world. When he finished, the silence that followed was full, not empty. It was as if the names had filled a room with light. After the formalities, Graham came and stood beside him. He didn't say much. He didn't need to. But his hand found Eli's shoulder in that old anchoring way. "You did good," he said, simple as a nailed board. Then Maria approached with a needle and thread tucked into a little kit. She had a small square of cloth in her hand and the extra letters waiting to be attached to Graham's cut. They didn't perform the sewing as theater. It was intimate and practical. She sewed Eli's name onto the inside seam of the patch. Small, private, a thing worn close to the chest. "That's how we do it," she said. "We put the names where they can keep you warm." Eli felt something settle in his chest. The patch was not a crown. It was a responsibility. Wearing it meant he would continue to show up, to listen, to stand within a tradition that was not static, but lived and breathed. It meant he would go on memorial rides and perhaps someday pick up a wrench for the guy who needed a hand. People began to find one another afterward, murmurs diffusing into conversation. Tommy and Graham sat on the bench till their voices were lower, softer, their hands dirtied by oil and shared work. They didn't erase the past. They acknowledged it, stitched it back into place with acts of repair. Derek came over and clapped Eli on the shoulder with something like acceptance, the kind that had been earned. Eli packed his camera away slowly, mindful now. His notebook held more than dates. It held sentences that he could not delete. He had come to record a club, but he had also been recorded by them, inscribed by their rituals, shaped by the texture of their grief and joy. Months after the memorial ride, the club's outreach did not explode into a polished program. It grew quietly, in ways that matched the group's temperament. One weekend workshop, a small mentoring circle at the community center, a rider showing up to help a young veteran with a housing application. Progress was steady but not immediate. There were meetings where they debated the scale of their work and argued over how public they should be. They set boundaries, which was important. They still had their rituals, their private nights, their need for closure. But they also opened a door, and more people came through it because the thing that had held them together, commitment, was now committed to a wider circle. Eli's role changed over time. He went from being an observer to someone who mediated between worlds. He'd sit in on a meeting with community volunteers and then sit down with a man who'd been in the club 20 years and translate the language without diluting it. He told stories with care, the way you tell someone's life, with attention to the small things that prove the truth of who someone was. He made documentaries for the local school, but he also helped organize a ride for veterans who had no one to honor them. He understood now that legacy isn't something you inherit as if it were a box of old letters. It's an ongoing practice of showing up, of doing the mundane and the brave in the same day. The cut remained in the clubhouse, tended to like a relic and used like a tool. Eli's name, stitched on the inner seam, glowed like a promise kept warm. People still argued, they still had their dark jokes, they still cried at night. But there was a new rhythm, a cadence of extending a hand, not to fix the world with a single gesture, but to keep it steady for someone else for a while. Sometimes, late at night, Eli would sit on the steps and listen to the engines fade away. He'd think of the afternoon when laughter had folded into silence and the patch had stepped into the room and the world had made itself a little different. He'd think of Maria's needle, the first crooked stitch that had become a straight line through practice. He'd remember Tommy and Graham at the bench, their hands working a piece of metal back together. He would recall the simple truth he had told the cemetery that day. Some things you inherit, some things you earn. Legacy, he'd learned, was not a static object, but an action. It was carried on the back of bikes and in the small rituals of a garage. It was sewn into sleeves and read aloud at dawn. It was not a thing you received, it was something you chose to take up. When people asked him what he'd learned making the documentary, Eli would say, "I learned to listen in a way that lets the story keep going.
I learned that belonging is the work you do, not the name on your jacket. The club kept riding. Names were read on fresh mornings and on evenings heavy with rain. New people came and some left. The club remained because someone each day decided it would be so. They were not perfect. They made mistakes. But they stayed on the ground, patch by patch, hand by hand. In the quiet after a meeting, Derek sometimes found Eli at the workbench, not with a camera, but with a rag and a socket. "You stayin'?" he asked once, half a question, half a challenge. Eli looked up from his hands, still smelling faintly of grease and resin. "Yeah," he said, "I am." Derek nodded, approval soft as a closing hinge. The boy who had walked into laughter left a room that would laugh with him, not at him. He had come to learn about a group of men and women who had shaped themselves into a chosen family. He left that space changed, wearing a heritage not as armor, but as a responsibility. The founding patch that had silenced the room had not been the end of anything. It had been an opening, a beginning of a story he now had the right and the obligation to carry forward. What legacy would you fight to preserve? If this touched you, share your thought below and consider following for more stories that keep remembering.